we'll move now into the project overview. Next slide. So just a little bit more information about CPI. We're an analytical and advisory nonprofit organization, and we're focused on the nexus of policy and finance for climate action. So what we do every day is climate finance. We work in three main areas. So we track and map climate finance flows and needs. This is a very data-heavy part of our work in our organization. We do analysis of the effectiveness of climate finance. And finally, we work with entrepreneurs, financial institutions, policymakers, and many stakeholders on the development of climate finance products and other solutions. So for this project on the next slide, what we're doing is undertaking an assessment of the investment needs, barriers, and opportunities for the GGRF. I just want to note that the project is generously supported by the JPMorgan Chase Foundation and Climate Works Foundation. And the goal of the project is really to support potential GGRF intermediaries and coalition members, the EPA, and the US climate finance ecosystem writ large in effectively deploying GGRF funds. We at CPI really believe in making sure that funds, public funds in particular, are deployed as effectively as possible, and that we define what effectiveness means upfront and really work together to ensure that that actually happens. So the project has two parts. And the first part is understanding investment needs and barriers, which is the focus of today's workshop. And we hope that these data can be useful to those of you who are preparing GGRF applications. The second part is then to use that assessment to identify technical assistance and financing models that can address these needs and barriers. And we hope that this part of the project will be useful to the implementation of the GGRF. So next slide, please. In terms of the timeline, we are wrapping up that first phase of the project with this workshop and a summary report, which will come out in the next week or so. And we're at the same time kicking off phase 2. And thanks some of you on the call with whom we've already spoken or scheduled an interview to discuss TA and financing models, and welcome further discussions with anybody who would like to talk with us about that. And the goal is to wrap up the project later this fall, and we're already looking into possibilities, including with other partners, of holding workshops in 2024 to further refine and develop TA and financing models. Now, finally, before I turn over to my colleague to talk through the analysis, I'd just like to acknowledge my colleagues who are working on the project with me, a few of whom are on the line. So first is Chris Brandt, who's a senior manager at CPI and lead on data science at CPI. Michelle Lee, who's an analyst at CPI. Miranda Duffy, who was our wonderful summer intern. She just finished, she just graduated from Penn State. Ashley Thomas, who's a climate justice and resilience consultant. Stuart Sarkozy-Benoxy, who's a senior advisor on the project with years of CDFI and climate resilience experience. And finally, Jessica Liston, who's a UC Berkeley Public Policy graduate student who did much of the data analysis that we're going to be presenting. So without further ado, let me turn over to Chris Brandt to walk you through the results of the part 1 of the project on investment needs analysis. I think, Michelle, we still need the slides up, if you could put them back up. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Bella. Yeah, and Michelle, when you get a chance, if you could put the slide deck back up. I'll be talking about our estimates of investment needs in GGRF eligible projects at the very local level. So next slide, please. And as I start, I want to make very clear that we all understand what exactly we mean by climate investment needs. And this is very much focused on the quantities of different clean technologies and infrastructure that needs to be deployed in order for the nation as a whole to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. The start of this is primarily an engineering exercise that's based on the characteristics and costs of the technologies themselves. It includes a technical analysis of regional energy needs and climatology in order to determine where specific technologies are best deployed. And it uses forecasts of costs of the various technologies to estimate sort of the like where they need to be deployed and when they can be deployed to minimize the overall net present value of the entire transition to net zero for the nation by 2050. So next slide. So for the estimates that we've produced, we relied on the Princeton Net Zero America project to do that engineering exercise that I just described. And what they did is produce state-level estimates of deployments for many different clean technologies, the sum of which lead to net zero national GHG emissions by 2050. We then took these Princeton results and focused only on those technologies that are relevant for GGRF eligible projects, that is, those related to distributed energy and storage, net zero buildings, and net and zero emissions transportation. We then downscaled these Princeton state level estimates to the census tract level, so sort of very, very granular local level, in order to produce estimates for CDFIs and other organizations that need to allocate funding at that granular local level. We identified those census tracts across the country that qualify as low-income and disadvantaged communities, LIDCs, per the GGRF Notice of Funding Opportunities. And I think it's probably, you're all familiar with those criteria for LIDCs in the GGRF, integrate kind of income measures of income, climate vulnerability, and other aspects of socioeconomic vulnerability. Finally, then we use the cost of each technology to estimate the investment needed in each LIDC and non-LIDC census tract for each GGRF relevant technology in each year. Next slide. So how can potential GGRF intermediaries, particularly CDFIs and green banks, and to some extent also state and local governments, use these data? We hope that they'll be helpful in a few ways as you're kind of preparing for GGRF applications and deploying any GGRF funding that you receive. First, we think that you can demonstrate that you have presence in and local knowledge of locations where there are high LIDC climate investment needs compared to locations where there maybe are fewer LIDCs and therefore fewer investment needs, climate investment needs in LIDCs. Second, if any GGRF coalition or individual organization wants to be involved in funding multiple types of projects in different locations, then the relative proportion of investment needs across project types and locations can help you develop a sort of baseline for how to allocate any GGRF funding that you receive. And I'll give a practical demonstration of what I mean by this in just a minute. But next slide. So first, I want to be clear, though, about the limitations of these estimates and what they can't help you do. First, the amount of investment needed, or estimated amount of investment needed in different project types and in different locations is not any kind of a recommendation about what types of projects your organization should finance. As I mentioned, these investment needs are about just how the country as a whole can get to net zero by 2050. They don't take account anything like your own organization's interests and priorities or your knowledge of the priorities of the communities in which you operate. They also don't provide any indication of which type of investments or projects will have the greatest impact on things like poverty, jobs, or equity, for example. It's just about reducing GHG emissions and getting to net zero. So you'll have to use your own knowledge of what will have the most impact on your communities and select those categories of projects or project types that you know will be sort of hit those dual goals of reducing GHG emissions and having a sort of positive impact on the communities where you operate. Additionally, at this point, this is still an initial run of our data and our results. So not all projects that are eligible for GGRF support are included in our estimates, although we are working to expand that coverage. Our estimates also currently only cover the continental United States, but we are working to expand them to also cover LIDCs in Alaska, Hawaii, and Puerto Rico. Additionally, we don't cover tribal lands separately, although they are separately identified as LIDCs in the GGRF criteria. They are included in those census tracts in which they lie in our data, but we don't include them separately. And we're investigating ways that we might be able to kind of separately identify needs for the tribal communities. Next slide. So here's a brief overview of our national level results. Across the country, the cumulative estimated investment needs for both LIDC and non-LIDC areas over 5-year periods is about $700 billion for 2020 through 2025, $1.7 trillion for 2026 through 30, and $3.2 trillion for 2031 to 35. In each period, the needs in LIDC census tracts, which are shown in red on this graph, are about 1/3 of the total, which is in line with the share of the US population that lives in LIDCs. On an annual basis, in just LIDCs, the needs amount to about $40 billion in 2023, accelerate to about $138 billion a year in 2030, and $234 billion a year in 2035. And the acceleration that you see both in the charts and sort of what I mentioned for the annual figures is that sort of as time goes on, there's increasingly intensive adoption of these clean technologies as it becomes more cost effective to do so. Next slide. So here is the distribution of investment needs by project type or GGRF project category for just LIDCs and just from 2020 through 2030. So as you can see, the largest single category is transportation, particularly light duty electric vehicles, that is personal EVs, at $530 billion. And this is pretty interesting, I think, because new EVs may be difficult really to deliver at scale for LIDCs, but these results do reflect the sort of need for clean, low carbon transportation in these areas. So this might be an opportunity to develop something like financing solutions for used EVs in LIDCs. Rooftop solar needs come in at about $150 billion from 2020 through 2030, residential building electrification at $83 billion, and commercial building electrification at $43 billion. So with that, I think, Michelle, if you could stop sharing, I'm going to share my screen to give a sort of demonstration of how you might, sort of what the data look like and how you might use them practically. So just give me 1 second to pull that up. All right, hope you can all see that, but let me know if anyone can't. So what I'm sharing here is particularly the state county summary tab of this spreadsheet that we distributed that I think will be the most useful to people looking for local level estimates. And sort of what you're seeing in the rows here along the left are the states. And then to the right, you're seeing the state total investment needs, starting out for the 2020 through 2025 period in LIDC census tracts in that state, in the state, in each state, non-LID census tracts, and then the total through 2020 through 2025, and then so on for 2026 through 2030. You know, and then over here on the far right, you can see the total for each state for 2025 through 2030 across, or 2035 rather, across all census tracts. And then if you scroll all the way down to the bottom, you get these grand total row at the very bottom for the nation as a whole. And then, you know, of course, the total for all time periods, the entire nation is about $6.5 trillion for 2020 through 2035. If I expand, I can expand any one state, and then I can see all of the counties in that state. So this first number here, about $35 million, shows the needs in LIDC census tracts within Autauga County, Alabama, for 2020 through 2035. $108 million for non-LIDC tracts in Autauga County 2020 through 35, and so on. I can expand the counties, and then I see the 3 GGRF project categories. So zero emissions buildings, distributed energy and storage, and then zero emission transportation. And then I can expand the each category and see the individual technologies underneath that category. So I think we're doing okay for time so far. So now I want to kind of demonstrate some of those use cases that I mentioned previously. And to do that, I'm going to focus on, well, first I'm going to, for simplicity of demonstration, I'm going to show only data for the time period of 2026 through 2030, and only LIDC census tracts. So here is just, I just filtered out things, so now we're only seeing investment needs for 2026 to 2030 in LIDC tracts in each state. I'm just going to focus on a couple of counties in California, which is what I'm most familiar with. And what I'm going to select is first Alameda County. Alameda County, which, if those of you who don't know, Alameda is a San Francisco Bay Area county where the city of Oakland is located. I'm also going to select Contra Costa County. Need to type correctly. Contra Costa County is another Bay Area county that's just north of Alameda County, and it's kind of a more suburban Bay Area county. And then finally, I'm going to select Marin County, which is also a Bay Area county, and it's a very wealthy county located kind of across the Golden Gate Bridge north of San Francisco, very wealthy. And so, you know, what we're seeing here, unsurprisingly, is within LIDC census tracts in Alameda County, there's about $1.8 billion worth of climate investment needs, GGRF climate investment needs for 2026 through 2030. Somewhat less, about $1 billion in Contra Costa County. And then in the wealthy county, Marin, very few LIDC investment needs because there are very few LIDCs. So I think, you know, you can demonstrate, if you're a CDFI that has strong knowledge of and location and experience in Alameda County, you know, you can demonstrate that you're in an area with high investment needs for the GGRF focus of LIDC communities, a somewhat lesser extent in Contra Costa County, Contra Costa, and not so much in Marin. And I think kind of you could do a similar analysis for any other areas of the country. Those of you have experience in these specific areas are going to know which are the counties roughly. So this provides some data that can validate your knowledge of that. So then looking at just how you might develop a kind of baseline funding allocation across project types, I'm going to filter out Marin County. Here we go. So just looking at Alameda and Contra Costa, and say I know already that I'm only interested in funding zero emissions buildings and distributed energy generation and storage projects, not transportation. I'm sort of role playing as a CDFI or other kind of GGRF intermediary, and I know that I want to focus on these project categories. So I can select just those. And what I'm seeing here is that for just these project categories and just these counties, there's about $575 million worth of investment needs in these two counties. About $350 million, or 61% of that total, is zero emissions buildings in Alameda County. $162 million, or 28%, is for zero emissions buildings in Contra Costa County. And likewise, $37 million, or 6% of the total, is distributed energy and storage in Alameda, and the remaining 5% is distributed energy and storage in Contra Costa. So I can use those relative shares of investment needs as a starting point for allocating any GGRF funding that I receive. For example, if I get $10 million from the GGRF, this would suggest about $6 million for zero emissions buildings in Contra Costa, in Alameda, $2.8 million for zero emissions buildings in Contra Costa, and so on. This is just a baseline starting point, but we hope that it at least provides, as I said, a way for you to get started in figuring out how to allocate these funds. And we hope this kind of gives you a bit of a sense of how these might be useful to you. I will stop sharing and turn it back to Bella. I think we're going to move on to the kind of roundtable and Q&A of the session, but there's more information about these estimates in the interim report that we're going to be releasing shortly. And I'm happy to answer any questions we have today if we have time, or offline in the future. Feel free to email me. Thanks.